Through all the age of steam, one name stands out above all others: Great Western. But what was it that made the Great Western so very special? One reason was the loyalty the company inspired among those who worked for it, no matter how dirty or unpleasant that work might be, like struggling to light fires and raise steam in the cold of the early morning. Very often, a career with the GWR became a family tradition. Sons followed fathers, nephews followed uncles, as porters, signalmen and guards, cleaners, firemen and drivers. Every one of them taking a pride in belonging to what they firmly believed was the finest railway company in the world, the railway equivalent of the Coldstream Guards. Another reason was the quality of the engineering. At the turn of the century, Great Western engines, like their competitors, were a jumble of different designs. Expresses were pulled by a succession of small four-coupled engines, but however well driven, they lacked the power to pull the heavy long-distance trains coming into service. That was the problem, and 20 years later, this was the solution. Two of the GWR's greatest engineers, Churchwood and Collett, had revolutionized the design of the steam locomotive by using the best ideas from both Europe and America to make a machine which was simple, efficient, powerful, and reliable. Churchwood began with two classes of express passenger engines, the Saints with 2 cylinders and the Stars with 4. His successor, Collett, upgraded the Star design to produce the Castle class, one of the most beautiful and the most successful engine designs ever built. With a taper boiler and 6 large driving wheels, the engines looked formidable, and they were. When they first appeared in 1923, they were the most powerful engines in Britain, and also the most efficient. That combination was extended to smaller engines too. Collett upgraded the Saint class in the same way, to produce a smaller version of the Castles, which could pull heavy passenger trains when the need arose, and also cope with freight trains. These were the Hall-class engines, which in time would become a familiar and well-loved sight all over the Great Western system. With smaller driving wheels and 2 cylinders instead of 4, they were workhorses rather than thoroughbreds, but their lines and their finish had the unmistakable Great Western quality. Quality which extended to every facet of the company's operations, to its bus, steamer and air services, as it did to its unrivaled safety record. Compared with driving a present-day diesel, steam engines needed care and skill to get the best from them. An experienced crew could work as a team, making sure the engine was ready for the next turn of duty. The fire would be built up to provide plenty of steam when there was a heavy train to pull. But whenever time allowed, a careful driver and fireman would rarely miss the chance to top up the water tanks, ready for whatever the rest of the day might bring. For many people, though, the Great Western wasn't symbolized by the speed and glamour of the mainline express. They remember it more like this: a branch line tank engine at a country station, ready to pull a pair of elderly coaches on an all-station stopping train to the nearest market town at an altogether slower and gentler pace. The engine is one of the smallest and lightest classes the company built. With inside cylinders and 4 driving wheels, the 1400 class of 042 tank engines were the mainstay of local services all over the company's system. They were often used for what was called auto train working. Running in one direction, the engine would pull the coaches behind it in the usual way. On the return journey, special connections between the engine and the train allowed it to push the coaches ahead of it, with the driver controlling the engine from the opposite end of the train. But whatever the size of the engines built by the GWR, they were built to the highest standards of quality and craftsmanship. An engine like the Castle class shone with immaculate paintwork, no easy task with smoke and coal dust everywhere. It sparkled with brass and copper, like a carefully tended Rolls-Royce. And these engines needed a lot of looking after. Every time an express engine finished a turn of duty, it would need coaling and watering, and turning round before its next job. Since today's diesel and electric locomotives have cabs at both ends, they don't need turning. So the only place to see an engine turn today is on a site like the Great Western Society Centre at Didcot in Oxfordshire. Here, a splendid collection of ex-Great Western engines is kept in the perfect location, an ex-Great Western engine shed. Great Western engines were designed to run on the best fuel in the world, Welsh steam coal, from mines deep in the heart of the company's territory in the industrial valleys of South Wales. The company built special coaling stages, like this one at Didcot Shed. Coal was brought here in wagons from the collieries. When an engine needed topping up, tubs could be loaded and tipped straight into the tender. Another once familiar sight, now all too rare. Shunting, too, was a familiar sight and sound on railways like the Great Western. Local goods trains needed to stop to reshuffle their wagons every time they needed to leave a consignment at a local station siding or pick up a wagon for a destination somewhere else on the system. It was a job which was slow, inefficient, and ultimately very expensive. But the sight of the engines steaming backwards and forwards over the points and the rumble of the wagons being pushed and pulled into position will stir a host of memories for those who remember the GWR in its heyday. Single-line working called for special precautions. To make sure only one train could run on each section of line at any time, the driver had to have a token as a symbol of his right to be there. When he passed from one section to another, he had to exchange the token for the section he'd just left for the token for the next section of line. And if a train was due to run in the opposite direction, the two trains could only cross when they arrived at a station with a passing loop, so the two trains could pass in safety. Today's Great Western enthusiasts are fortunate in being able to see the old company at work on several restored lines in different parts of the system. GWR trains run in South Wales, in the West Country on the Dart Valley Line and the Torbay Steam Railway, and here in the West Midlands on the 18 miles of the Severn Valley Railway, linking Bridgnorth with a new purpose-built terminus at Kidderminster, connecting to the British rail system. This engine, number 3205, is a 2251 class 060, another familiar and well-loved sight on many a Great Western branch. It was the first engine to work on the Severn Valley Line when it reopened in private hands after British Rail closed it in 1963. And now it's enjoying another lease of life on the West Somerset Line between Taunton and Minehead. Keeping these beautiful old engines running in first-class condition depends on a lot of volunteers to undertake the hard work. Apart from driving and firing the engines, there's a lot of maintenance work to be done. Not to mention cleaning and polishing wherever there's a gap in the timetable, so they look as good as new, more than 40 years after the last of them were built. But there were always compensations, even in the hard and often dirty work of operating a steam locomotive. One of them was the footplate breakfast. Eggs and sausages and bacon fried in the firebox on a clean shovel and eaten in the open air with slices of bread and a can of tea. Fuel to keep a man going through the longest and most tiring shift in any kind of weather. those old enough to remember the old Great Western, these are the memories of a lifetime. Of family journeys to seaside holidays, to school, to town, and later on to work. Journeys where the pace of life was slower, with time to scan the sepia pictures of spas and bathing beaches, lulled to drowsiness by the rhythm of the carriage wheels and the smoke drifting past the windows. Best of all, not every train was an express. Most of them were content to pause at wayside stations to offload passengers and luggage, bicycles and newspapers, while the engine and its crew dozed in the sunshine till it was time to go. Yet all good things have to come to an end. When railway nationalisation loomed ahead, it seemed as if the GWR's days were numbered. When, later still, the beaching axe began to fall, the future seemed darker still. But for everyone who saw the light go out on the old Great Western Railway at the end of 1947, it seemed as if the darkness might go on forever. The idea that the company's old trains might emerge into a newer and brighter future would have seemed an impossible dream. The possibility that they might still be running almost 50 years after the old company passed into the pages of the history books would have seemed the cruelest of jokes. For years it seemed as if the steam railway in general, and the Great Western in particular, had vanished into the past forever. The fires had been dropped, the boilers had cooled, and the engines were bound for the scrapyard. A whole way of life, a whole tradition was passing away. However, market forces and commercial realities could still be overturned by hard work, dedication, and boundless enthusiasm. Teams of volunteers tackled the enormous task of turning back the clock, reopening stations, and bringing back the trains and the passengers to closed and restored lines. In Devon, Cornwall, Somerset and Shropshire, Oxfordshire and South Wales, and a host of other places all over GWR territory, they've rescued and rebuilt engines and put them back into running order, gleaming like new. More and more of them, until it became possible for new generations to see and enjoy the GWR for themselves, to become part of that enduring and unquenchable Great Western experience.